Our presenter today is Dr. Elizabeth Rule. She is the director of the AT&T Center for Indigenous Politics and Policy, assistant professor of professional studies, director of the Semester in Washington Politics program, and faculty in residence at the George Washington University. She is an enrolled citizen of the Chickasaw Nation. While at GW, she has served as the principal investigator on a number of research projects. In the summer of 2019, she created the Guide to Indigenous DC, which is what she will be presenting to us today. It is a mobile application and digital map of Indigenous sites of importance in the nation's capital. We welcome her here today. We're so pleased that she could join us. This is right across the river from us if you are living or working in Arlington. So it's a fantastic resource for us to be able to explore this evening. Welcome, Dr. Rule, and thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Megan, and thank you just to the entire library for hosting this event. It's really my pleasure to be here today and share a little bit about one of my research projects that is both recent and ongoing. So I really look forward to sharing that with you today, and also to a great discussion. Please feel free to ask any and all questions. I'm happy to answer them, and look forward to dialoguing with you there. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can go ahead and start the presentation. Okay, great. So as Megan said, I created the Guide to Indigenous DC in July of 2019. So it has been active for just over a year now. And what the Guide to Indigenous DC is a public and freely accessible, free of cost iOS mobile application. In layman's terms, that means that if you have an iPhone, you can download the Guide to Indigenous DC right now, free of cost for your iPhone. And don't worry, the Android version is coming soon. That's a question I always get. It's coming soon. It's in progress. This has been a completely grant-driven project. So I had to secure some additional support, but that's going to be coming soon. And I'm really happy that that's going to expand our audience even more. So as I said, the Guide to Indigenous DC is available as an iOS application on iPhone right now. It's a fully independent mobile application. So here you can see it on my screen's homepage. And once you go into the app, you have the option of selecting the Guide to Indigenous DC walking tour. This is really, the premier tour of Indigenous sites of importance in DC, of which there are 17 that I identify. Of course, these sites are not exhaustive. There are many more, but these were curated by me to really highlight some of the components of Indigenous DC history and the contemporary community that I wanted to share with audiences. Really, the story of how Indigenous DC came to be was that I work at GW. I'm a professor here, and I administer what's called the Native American Political Leadership Program and the Inspire Pre-College Program. These are two programs that seek to bring Indigenous students, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, and American Indian students from all over the country to Washington, DC for an on-the-ground experiential learning semester. For our college students, we serve undergraduate students, graduate students, and recent graduate students. And those students receive a full scholarship that covers their travel to the Capitol. We arrange internships with them in a Native advocacy office or on Capitol Hill as it aligns with their own interests. And then they also take courses. One of those courses is with me on Native politics and policy. Another is just foundational government course that focuses on legislative processes, elections, and so on. For our Inspire students, they also receive a full scholarship program. These are high school students, and so they come for a reduced term, but really they have the opportunity to take a class in Native politics again and really get that experience learning about the capital city, and really importantly, taking that jump from their hometown to an institution of higher education, really supporting the next generation of Indigenous youth as they decide to pursue higher ed. So these are the programs that I run and administer and teach for. And as I was doing this, I just kept hearing feedback from my students that, you know, they were homesick, some of them, but also some of them were really saying that they felt just out of place in DC, right? They felt like Native people and their cultures weren't necessarily represented here, and they were kind of invisible, for lack of a better term. Coupling this with, you know, the Washington football team, you know, image and mascot and name, being in DC was kind of a difficult experience for a lot of my Native students. And I did not want that to be the case, right? As a Native person who lives in DC, you know, but comes from a tribe in Oklahoma, I was aware of the really rich and diverse Native community here, and had also been learning about the Indigenous history of the capital city. And this is the nation's capital, right? Everyone should feel welcome and represented here, right? This is the seat of power for our country. And so I really sought out to create a learning tool to help those students understand more about what they were doing as young and emerging ambassadors of their tribal nations, coming to DC and following many times in their ancestors' footsteps in that legacy of advocacy, right? And relationship building on a government to government level between tribal nations and the federal United States government. And so I created the Guide to Indigenous DC. So once you go into the application, really the way that it's set up is as a walking tour, but you can also generate metro, driving, or bicycling routes. And very importantly, do not have to use this app simply as a tour mechanism. I'm happy to talk about the many diverse uses of the app beyond the tour function. But here you'll see a basic map of the layout of these 17 sites. And again, these 17 sites are not exhaustive. They're just some of my favorite sites that I've learned about that really demonstrate the idea that DC is Indian land, that it is the traditional ancestral homelands of Native people, but also that Native people have a very strong presence here today. So just to go through some of those sites really quickly, the first one is actually across the river over on the library side in Arlington, and that's the U.S. Marine Corps War Memorial. That was really important to incorporate because that's one of those iconic tourist sites that everyone who comes to DC for the first time wants to visit. That's a really strong image in our popular imagination as a country of those service members hoisting the flag at Iwo Jima. But what many people don't know is that one of those service members depicted is actually Ira Hayes, and he is a Pima tribal member. So that was a way to really show that even in these iconic, well-recognized, well-known institutions like these national monuments, Native people are there, even if they're not recognized widely. So I wanted to shine a light on that history. Another site, of course, is Theodore Roosevelt Island, or Anna Loston. This is a small strip of land really off of the west of Georgetown in the river there. And this is a place where Native people who had been living in encampments along the Anacostia River sought refuge as DC was developing into a more urban environment. There was, increasing contact between Native and settler communities, and so temporarily, those communities relocated and sought refuge on Theodore Roosevelt Island, right off of the Georgetown neighborhood. Again, that's a historical site, but number 3 is a much more contemporary site. And this is the Indigenous Peoples March. This is one of a couple of different sites of Indigenous activism that have taken place throughout the decades. DC, of course, is known for being a hub of protest and resistance and marches. And I wanted to show that Native people also participate in that really rich legacy of activism in the capital city. So the Indigenous Peoples Marches there, that happened as early as 2019, so very recent. Number 4 is also an activist moment, and that was the occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. This was an action that took place rather spontaneously as Native activists who caravanned all the way from the West Coast as part of the Trail of Broken Treaties, descended upon DC to meet with their government representatives. Those meetings were not attended by those government officials. And so the activists decided to actually occupy the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is part of the Department of the Interior, and really make a symbolic statement, right, that the Bureau of Indian Affairs is for Native people. Number 5 is actually an artistic site. So again, I hope that you're seeing the real breadth and depth of the different types of content here. And that's the murals at the Department of the Interior. These are murals done by a handful of Native artists who are commissioned to represent the culture, lifestyle, and history of various Indigenous groups. And they're scattered throughout this federal building. Similarly, number 6 is also an artistic site, and it's one that I'm proud to say is on the GW campus. And that is the Mural of Piscataway History and Culture. An artist collaborated very closely with some Piscataway community members and was able to depict in a very interesting street graffiti style a lot of that history and culture. And that's in the flag building of the Corcoran School of Art and Design on the GW campus. Number 7 takes us way back in time again, and it focuses on some of the archaeological Native artifacts that were discovered on the White House grounds, actually, in the 70s when the White House was doing some landscaping and creating the pool. So again, the purpose of that very early history is, again, to say, even a place as symbolic and representative as the White House is built on fundamentally Native territory. Number 8 is, again, a more recent Indigenous activist moment. That's the Native Nations March. Number 9 is the Kicking Bear and Buffalo sculptures at Dumbarton Bridge. This is a really fascinating site. There was actually a 19th century Oglala Lakota tribal leader by the name of Kicking Bear. And he visited DC as part of his efforts to advocate for his community. While he was here, he worked with the Smithsonian, and they did a life cast of his likeness that was kept in their collection for some time until the architect of what became Dumbarton Bridge found that cast and actually used it to create the likeness of Kicking Bear all along this bridge. So you're not able to see it if you're walking on top of the bridge, but you can see it from below. And on either side of the bridge are also these big, enormous buffalo sculptures. So the thinking was that this bridge would actually pay homage to this closing of the frontier, this American nostalgia for a conquered West. And actually, it ends up being very ironic because Kicking Bear, the man whose face is actually imprinted all over this bridge, was really in a lot of ways an anti-colonial leader. Number 10, the Embassy of Tribal Nations. DC, of course, is famous for its Embassy Row, but people often don't realize that there is Native representation there as well. That's the Embassy of Tribal Nations, and that's the office of the National Congress of American Indians that does a lot of work for tribal nations on the federal level. Again, the embassy component is so important here because it emphasizes that tribal governments have a nation-to-nation relationship with the United States. Number 11 is, again, an activist moment. That's the Cowboy and Indian Alliance Camp. When I took my students out to actually do this tour, it was really amazing to be able to look at photographs of this event where activists erected teepees and rode horses in on the National Mall. And so I took my students out to the National Mall, and we were able to line ourselves up and stand in that very place and orient ourselves to the Washington Monument and see exactly where that activist moment had taken place and unfolded. Number 12 is Bill Reed's Spirit of Haida Gwaii sculpture. This is an impressive, amazing piece of First Nations art located outside of the Canadian Embassy here in DC. There's a counterpoint to this sculpture actually in the Vancouver airport, but it is really a tribute to Haida mythology, and again is just very imposing and regal. Number 13 is perhaps the most widely recognized site of Indigenous importance, and that, of course, is the National Museum of the American Indian as part of the Smithsonian system. And number 14 is associated with that. That's the National Native American Veterans Memorial. This memorial was actually just dedicated last week. And what was really interesting about that was, of course, up until last week, this was a site on a map that did not yet exist, right? And I really incorporated that to demonstrate that Native people not only exist in the past and don't even only exist in the future, in the present, but also in the future, right? So this was a projection, again, of how Native people are literally making their mark in the capital city. Number 15 focuses on Native leader statues at the US Capitol. So every state in the country donates 2 representative statues that speak to who they are as a state. And so there are a handful of these that are actually dedicated to tribal leaders and Native folks. So those are there at the US Capitol building. Number 16 is the Liberty and Freedom Lummi Totem Poles. This is an installation that really was a tribute to those who lost their lives as part of the September 11th terrorist attacks. And these totem poles traveled all the way from the West Coast across the country through different tribal communities, being blessed along the way before finding its final place here in DC. And then number 17, also at the Congressional Cemetery, is a site dedicated to the dozens, actually, of tribal leaders and delegates who came to DC for work. Again, as representatives of their tribal nations, as advocates of their Indigenous communities. In some cases, they ended up staying and making their lives here, but in others, and more often, unfortunately, they fell ill or had an accident of some sort and now call DC their final resting place. So just as I walk you through those sites, I hope you again see the breadth and depth of the subject material here, which again gets to the purpose of the guide, which is to show that DC is Native land. We have been here as Native people. We are here as Native people and will continue to be here as Native people. And also that our influence as Native people cannot be relegated just to history, just to politics, but that it expands across all disciplines and areas into the arts, activism, policy, national monuments, archaeology. So that's my intention with curating these 17 sites in particular. So here I want to point out a couple of special features of the app itself. And that is the ability to do our virtual tour mode. So users can log into the settings on the left-hand side there and set it to virtual tour mode, which means that you do not have to be in DC to make use of the Guide to Indigenous DC. For those folks who are in the city itself, you can opt to actually geolocate yourself in relation to these sites. So you can either complete all or part of the walking tour or driving tour, but you can also just visit one-off sites to see what's close to you that's related to Indigenous people. But even for users all the way on the other side of the world, they can use the virtual tour mode, which gives them access and virtually walks them through the same tour, just as if they were here. Also, the virtual tour mode offers 360-degree on-the-ground virtual imaging. So at each of those sites, you can actually stop and put the 360-degree mode on and look around yourself, very much simulating the experience of being at these sites on the ground. It's also been important to me as the creator of this app to make sure that this fosters a sense of dialogue. Again, the inspiration for coming up for this really dealt with Native invisibility and misunderstanding about who we are as Native people. And so I wanted to create a couple of different ways for that message to be spread. So you'll see as a user, you have the ability to share this content on Twitter, in a text message, email, Facebook, whatever it may be. There are some pre-populated hashtags that we use to create a digital community and digital stream of use. And users that way are able to share either one individual site or the entire guide. This image here really, again, illustrates some of the different features we have, which include different types of maps that users can choose in the settings, the ability to zoom in and really get close or zoom out. And I think both of those offer important points, right? Being able to zoom in, of course, is user friendly. You can see exactly where these places are. But on the macro level, right, for those who zoom out, it was really important for me to also show that these sites are scattered across the city, right? They encompass north, south, east, west. And that was really important because oftentimes I hear, people tell me that they have this idea that Native people are just off somewhere. They don't really know where, right? But they're just not here. They're somewhere. They're sequestered, secluded. And again, that's just not the case, right? Native people live in DC. We've made our mark here, and not just in one area, right? But really all throughout. Here are some additional images of those views, right, that a user can get, as well as the 360-degree button on the bottom there. That's what you tap to get that on-the-ground imaging. So now I want to talk a little bit about the sites themselves and what users see on that level. This is one example, and this is the Piscataway History and Culture mural on the GW campus. So when users actually get to a site or click on a site, they'll be provided with a gallery of images that they can scroll through up top, as well as a short description of what that site is. And really, my intention with creating these descriptions was to make it as accessible as possible. So it's a relatively brief history, but I incorporate additional links to get more information if anyone's interested in doing a deeper dive. And I'm also really happy to say that since launching a year ago, there has been a lot of positive reception and a hunger really from the public for more information. And so I'm actually transforming the app into a book to provide that deeper level of engagement. So that's forthcoming. Once someone finishes the tour or decides to exit out, um, I had a very interesting conversation with my coder about metrics for engagement, right, and user feedback. And what we really decided on was that the simple thumbs up or thumbs down is very well known in our society. And so we've been able to gather, the thumbs up liked it versus didn't like it. And users report a feedback ratio of 37 to 1, 37 like it to 1 didn't like it. So very proud of that, which seems to indicate that we're meeting the need, that users are enjoying the experience. We have a 4.5-star rating in the Apple App Store, and at this point have been downloaded over 2,500 times. More than 4,000 individual tours have been taken, and we've made over 12,000 impressions. Again, to keep that conversation going, there's the ability to sign up for a mailing list, which will provide updates. And again, some data collection on the back end to really be able to see how users are engaging with this app, engaging with the space and the land around them, in order to make it, as user friendly as possible, and make sure that it's meeting its intended goals. Coming up on, a year since its launch, I'm doing a lot of expansion work at this point. As I said at the beginning of my presentation, I'm working on developing an Android version to get this in the hands of additional audience members, potential audience members. There have also been conversations about putting this into print, right? And actually creating a brochure-like paper image of this to put in a couple of those sites themselves that have buildings or offices affiliated with them. And also, you see here I included video. That's to incorporate additional multimedia components. You'll see that some of the sites do have video affiliated with them right now, while others don't. My goal is to do even more research and carry out oral history interviews and testimony from people who can speak their expertise about each of these sites, and then embed that into the app. I'm also really on a journey to create new tours. So if anyone is interested in potentially partnering, there has really been a grassroots uprising around this concept. And oftentimes when I present to audiences, people say, I know of this site, you need to incorporate this as well. Or, we want to bring this concept to an additional area. So right now, I'm actually creating a couple of new tours themselves within the Guide to Indigenous DC. One of those would map contemporary Native advocacy organization offices in the city, again, to show that, Native issues are not just a one-off topic, right? But there are actually, again, dozens of these advocacy organizations in DC right now doing great work. Another expansion area would be to really build out that Congressional Cemetery component. So I mentioned there are dozens of tribal leaders who, buried at that location. And I'd like to actually do, a mini tour of each of those individuals, right? And be able to get into their individual stories and focus on them for people who go to that one site to be able to engage on a much deeper level with sort of the sites within the site, if you will. The art at the Capitol building and the Department of the Interior murals offer the same possibility, right? There are sort of sites within a site. These are sites that, house various different objects and images and murals and pieces and so on. And again, just to be able to go to that deeper level of engagement and explain more about each individual piece for someone who maybe just goes to that one particular site. And lastly, Indian activism. So I'd really like to do an expansion project that focuses just on those sites of Indigenous activism. Again, I've said it a number of times now, but this is not an exhaustive list, right? And even though I incorporate 3 or 4 sites of Indigenous activism, there's actually many more than that. And so really, I hope that you see through this that the possibilities here are endless, right? And they all serve what I view to be the most important goal here, which is to, you know, talk about Native history, but also talk about the Native present and future, literally demonstrate the mark that Native people have made on this city, through the visual of a map, right? And geography there and cartography. And then also, making this material accessible through a digital app format that can be accessed and used by people here, but also people elsewhere. DC, again, it's the capital of our country. It's such an iconic city, but unfortunately, it's not known for being associated with Native people. The guide to Indigenous DC really sets out to disrupt that, to make Native people central actually to the conversation about DC, to the understanding of this history historically and in the present moment, and so on. And then finally, I'm also doing expansion beyond DC. So I'm currently working on a guide to Indigenous Baltimore. So that will be forthcoming. I recently completed, it's still somewhat in the works, but mostly completed, a guide to tribal colleges and universities. That was actually a different sort of project because it's on the national scale. And that actually looks at, again, the history of tribal colleges and universities and what they can offer students today who are thinking about attending one of these institutions. Again, with the ultimate goal of serving Native students. And I'm expanding to do additional work on, the state level, working with different states to do guide to Indigenous state. Different organizations that have maybe holdings of Native focused materials have approached me about creating an app for them of this nature. Other cities, again, like Baltimore is a great example, tribal nations, right? This could be a great tool and resource for highlighting cultural heritage preservation, highlighting tribal history, highlighting tribal business, whatever it may be, through tribal partners. And then also I'm working with colleges and universities to uncover the Indigenous history of whatever their school is and the land that their school is built upon. So those are some of the various projects in the works, and I'm happy to talk about any and all of them. Thank you so much again for having me and sharing this material with you. I look forward to a great conversation.
Thank you so much for presenting. That was very informative, and we have a number of questions. The first one, this person would like to know practical ways people who are not Indigenous to the area can be in solidarity with people who are Indigenous, other than doing land acknowledgements at meetings and learning more about Indigenous peoples. Are there additional ways to be in solidarity?
Yeah, absolutely. And you do name 2 really good ones for people who are, just making their entrance into this area, who want to show solidarity. Land acknowledgements are a great way to do so. And of course, just learning about Indigenous people is a great way to learn about us. And show solidarity because, of course, knowledge is power. On a very practical level, right? I live in DC, I work in DC. My research actually, beyond the guide to Indigenous DC, focuses on violence against Native women, right? And the missing and murdered Indigenous women's issue. So one of the best ways that you can support Indigenous communities is by supporting tribal sovereignty. What that means is that you support tribes to be able to self-govern and self-determine their own path. Right now, there are 574 individual federally recognized tribal nations in the United States. 574, right? And they're all totally distinct. They have their own governments, their own languages, their own spiritualities, their own cultural practices, and they're extremely diverse. Um, you know, the history and culture and policy issues affecting, Alaska Natives are very different than, tribal communities living in Florida, for example, right? And, one of the ways, though, that you can really support all of these communities in DC or elsewhere around the country is to support the idea of tribal sovereignty, right? Tribal sovereignty is a pressing policy issue. But again, it goes back to that idea of being able to relate to the United States government on a nation to nation level, government to government level, right? And, tribal sovereignty is inherent, but constantly in the Supreme Court and legislation, policy, law, we see attacks on tribal sovereignty, right? These are things that we see in the news, breaking issues. But it's really important to be aware that, again, tribes have the right to govern themselves. And a great way to show solidarity with any Indigenous community is to support their self-governance, their self-empowerment. And again, that looks different in different places, but by supporting tribal sovereignty, you can really support all Indigenous people.
Thank you. The next question comes from Mickey, who asks, is the person at the Marine Corps Memorial, Ira Hayes, visible in one of the statues?
Yes, yes. He is one of the service members depicted raising the flag at Iwo Jima. I think, most of us have seen that image. They're raising the flag. And he is one of those individuals. So yes, he is very visible right there.
The next question's from Eva. She asks about number 5 and number 6 on the list, which is the Department of Interior murals and the Mural of Piscataway history. That's the one at GW.
Yes.
Are those available to go in now with the COVID restrictions?
That's a really good question. I'm actually not sure. I know that GW is not open to the public. It's also not even open to staff and faculty right now. But on a normal day outside of COVID, yes, that building is publicly accessible. And the same is true for the Department of the Interior. You have to go through security to get into the Department of the Interior because it's a federal building, but anyone is allowed to go in and view these murals.
Okay. Another person had a similar question, and I did look up the Department of Interior indicates that they are at this time not open, but they do have an online tour.
Okay. Great.
So another person asks if you have close-ups. Do you have close-up pictures in the app for people to view?
Close-ups. I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that question, but there's a variety of images in the gallery, and they kind of vary depending on what the site is. So, for example, not all of the murals in the Department of the Interior are depicted in the photo gallery, but for other sites, some of those images are archival, right? They're of historical moments or so on. And so that's actually a very interesting component for me, is going to a place where there's otherwise no visible marker at all of what occurred in these places, and all we have are the photos that others took of a particular action, let's say, for example. But Other sites, like the Spirit of Haida Gwaii sculpture, there are some, detailed photos of different facets of that really magnificent piece of art.
Okay. Alicia asks if are there any mutual aid or other initiatives specifically for Native and Indigenous people in the DMV area? Are there any other ways we can better apply to these communities?
Yeah, so I'm not able to specifically endorse any particular, organization, for instance, but I can say that there are, again, dozens of, Native focused offices in DC, and these offices range, extremely right in their subject matter and focus area. So we have everything like my center, right, the Center for Indigenous Politics and Policy, and the educational programming that we do beyond our research efforts, to things like the National Congress of American Indians, which is a member-based group that seeks to represent national Native issues here. And then you have other organizations focused on Indigenous health. Housing is an issue. The arts and culture is another area. So really, if there's a particular area that you're interested in knowing more about or getting involved in, or offering your support in some way, I'm sure you can find them by Googling whatever subject matter it is that you're interested in. DC Native American subject matter. I'm sure you'll come up with a lot of different options.
And of course, being a librarian, I will always encourage everyone, get in touch with your local librarian. We have several reference librarians here on staff. If you have a basic question, a very involved research question, we can help you get started. Okay, Nancy asks if you're aware of the Potomac Overlook Park in Arlington. Apparently there's some historical significance there.
No, I'm not. But thank you for bringing that to my attention. I'm going to write that down right now. Potomac Overlook Park. Again, this is one of the real pleasures and joys for me about doing this type of work, that in so many ways is community engaged and public facing, which is that literally every time I talk to an audience about this, someone says, oh, you haven't seen this particular site. You need to know about this particular area or what happened here. And that again is really how I came to curate those 17 sites, was through conversation with people, and people lending their expertise to me. Again, this is a project that really was developed out of my own interest in serving my Native students, that once I created it, I started to see all of the possibilities for serving a much broader audience. And so it's very fun to be working in this type of public humanities work, where it's constantly evolving, constantly changing. And again, the more information, the better, right? It better serves the mission and the public, as we seek to uplift Native people.
Thank you. And thank you to Nancy for suggesting it.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy.
Jennifer asks, how and when can land acknowledgements be appropriate and authentic, especially in terms of offering an acknowledgement prior to a public program whose content may not be directly about Native American culture?
Sure, that's a really good question. And there is a lot of work and research being done precisely on this that you can find online to read about some of the pros and pitfalls, or limitations, let's say, of land acknowledgements. So for anyone who's unfamiliar with what a land acknowledgement is, it's essentially a statement at the beginning of proceedings of some kind, typically a conference or event, meeting, that recognizes the traditional Indigenous lands upon which said event is taking place. This is really important as an awareness raising tool, right? To make sure that we recognize, again, that all of what we call the United States now is the traditional homelands of one Indigenous group or another. But it also does the important work of building some of those community relations between local tribal groups and whatever organization or office is hosting the event. I would not say that it needs to be limited to Native American content, the event, that is. A land acknowledgement really is, part of a welcoming speech. There's always an introduction at any sort of get together. And a land acknowledgement is really just a moment of reflection and, paying honor and tribute to the events that occurred, the people who occurred, the land stewardship in place that makes that function possible. The limitations of land acknowledgements are being talked about more and more these days, which I think is also really good. There are some scholars who point out that land acknowledgements themselves can often be merely symbolic, right? And in some cases, when folks use land acknowledgements to say that they're engaging with Native people, that they're engaging Native communities, but it ends on that surface level of just acknowledging that this is someone's land. That's where some people say, actually there needs to be more, right? There needs to be a deeper level of engagement. And I've seen it brilliantly explained. I'm a professor, right? So in a classroom, I've seen people take the water bottle, let's say, of a student and say, I have your water bottle. And they're like, okay, but I want my water bottle back, right? And so that's sort of the critique of land acknowledgements on the flip side, which is merely stating that you're on Indigenous land as a symbolic gesture really isn't doing quite the restorative justice work that a lot of institutions seek to do, which is very important.
Thank you. That's a very interesting topic. Okay, we have the next question is from Karen, who asks, how many tribes and which Indigenous peoples lived in this area? Are there any other resources? There's a number of people who've asked this question, asking where they can find that information.
Absolutely. And that's a really important one. I want to start off by saying that I am actually not a formal historian and I'm not an expert in this particular subject matter, being the traditional peoples of this land. But from what I understand, the DMV region generally was home to the Piscataway Confederacy. And this was a group made up of different villages and smaller chiefdoms. It may be the Piscataway chiefdom. The Piscataway people is the larger umbrella group, from what I understand. These people exist today, right? They're actually organized as state recognized tribes in Maryland. And there are also, of course, Native people in Virginia. In the last couple of years, there have been 6 tribes in Virginia who have received federal recognition. And of course, it's always difficult when we talk about these things because there aren't precisely those, state borders that we use as a metric for understanding land today, right? So there, of course, were territories, but there was also various levels of interaction and change and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples in this entire DMV area. A lot of times also people will hear about the Anacostians, and they also were sort of a particular subset of Native people along the Anacostia River, who were part of that network. So that is by no means an exhaustive history or explanation of the indigenous peoples of the DMV area, but I hope that it provides enough context for you to go do additional research and learn more about that history from people who really specialize in that.
Thank you. We have some more questions about how you plan to expand the app. Do you have any other plans to expand the app in the DMV area or nationally besides what you mentioned in Baltimore?
Yes, there are a lot of expansion plans in the works. So again, some of those include literally elaborating on sites that are now part of the Guide to Indigenous DC. So the Department of the Interior murals is one of them. The Congressional Cemetery is one of them. And when I say expand, I mean literally break those out into new maps that cite those various sites within what right now I'm calling one site on the grander map. And then on the national level, I'm working with a couple of state partners. I'm in the very early stages of that, and also university partners to uncover the indigenous history of their institution and the land upon which they're built, tribal partners. So there are going to be a lot of expansions in the coming months and years. And again, the Android version of the Guide to Indigenous DC should be released in the next 6 months or so.
Okay, yes, that was another question that somebody had, so we will definitely keep an eye out for that. Todd asks, is there a way to get more information on the GW experiential learning programs you mentioned? Is there a website or point of contact that people should get in touch with?
Yes, absolutely. So those program names are Googleable. The first program for Native undergrads, graduate students, and recent graduates is called the Native American Political Leadership Program. We also go by the acronym NAPLP. We are active on Facebook and Twitter, and we also have a website. The second experiential program is the Inspire pre-college program. It's Inspire in all caps. It also has Facebook, Twitter, and a website. And of course, our umbrella center is the AT&T Center for Indigenous Politics and Policy. Sometimes we go by the acronym CIPP, CIPP. We are also on Facebook, Twitter, and have a website. So I hope that you'll maybe share information about our student programs if you have Native youth that may be interested. And if you're interested in engaging more with our center, we always love to do community outreach.
Thank you. We have a comment, sort of question from Donald, who was asking about sites in DC where there were Indian settlements or villages. He used to live in Wesley Heights, and there was a raised plateau there that he had been told was a settlement. So that is another suggestion for
Great.
you to look into.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I'm writing that down right now. Again, one of the real pleasures of this line of work for me is, it's really the case in point, right? The purpose of this app is to show that all of this territory was Indian land. And so it makes sense, right, that there would be constantly new streams of information about sites, activities, moments that occurred across this territory over the course of a couple hundred years. So thanks so much for that suggestion.
Okay, so we have a question from another attendee who is asking about the Arlington National Cemetery. Have you explored that site to add any recognition of the people who are buried there who died throughout the years.
Yeah, that's a really good site, and that's going to be one of my first sites of investigation when I, expand more into Virginia. But you're absolutely right. Arlington National Cemetery is again the final resting place of a couple of different Native folks, and right now that's just not included as part of DC. It was a little bit beyond the scope. I know that I have the one site right at the beginning, but I do hope to shine a light on Arlington National Cemetery in a more Virginia focused tour. So thank you for that. Yeah, that's also really important.
Okay. We have a two-part question from Nancy, who is asking about the Navajo language code writers in World War II, if they are connected to a physical site or monument in DC.
That's a really good question. Not that I'm aware of. Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. And the second part of her question is asking about the Native American museums across the US so people can look at history closer to their homes. I know you said that you were going to work with some of those institutions.
Yes, yes. Right now, you're exactly right. There are dozens and dozens of tribal museums that are run by, these tribal governments, and these are really great places to learn about, tribal specific history because it's told entirely from the community perspective. I've actually done separate research a little bit in this area, and they're really amazing. The incorporation of native languages is really wonderful, and just the ability to have a totally different perspective on US history and politics and culture. Oftentimes, in the mainstream, we hear about American history starting only a couple of hundred years ago, right? But of course, when we take the tribal perspective there, our history, their history started, thousands of years ago, many thousands of years ago. And so it just really provides a totally different context for thinking through, some of these histories, and it makes 300 years or so seem like not that long of a time. Yeah, tribal museums are really wonderful resources. I would encourage everyone to check out, whatever institutions are close to them.
Thank you. Nafisa asks if you can discuss how you obtained and sought funding for this project.
Sure. Yeah. So it has been entirely grant sponsored. And initially, it received support from the American Indian College Fund, the Minneapolis Foundation, and Native Americans in Philanthropy. And since then, I've also received a couple of additional grants, one from American University, which sought to incorporate the guide into some curricular programs there and actually take students out to visit these sites. Of course, I do that in my own classroom as well, not grant funded. And then also just very recently, I was named an MIT Solve Indigenous Communities Fellow. And through that work, I'm also doing a lot of this expansion that I discussed earlier.
Okay, the next question is from Joy. She asks if you've had a conversation with the National Parks Service about other sites with Indigenous history.
I have not sat down and spoken to the National Park Service. I do rely on some of their historical resources to inform my understanding of these places. But, again, a partnership with them would be very natural and fitting.
We have a suggestion from Beth, who suggest a collaboration with the NE, I'm guessing that's Northeastern, Archaeological Conservancy in Frederick would provide some depth to your tours. So thank you, Beth. That's a good suggestion.
Thank you.
And we have another suggestion from John, who suggests you speak to a person called Ashley Minner, Minner. She's developed an amazing resource on Lumbee spaces in Baltimore and would be a great person to get in touch with.
That's my partner for the Guide to Indigenous Baltimore.
Perfect. Okay. We have a question from Lita. She asks, is the Museum of the Indian prominent in advancing your program? Have you worked with them, and how will you interface with them in the future?
Yeah, so the National Museum of the American Indian, again, is by far and away the most visible representation of Native people in DC, and we do work with them on some levels. We've had some folks from them come and deliver talks for us, and we regularly attend each other's events. We are not, formal partners on this Guide to Indigenous DC app, but of course, they needed to be incorporated as a site because they are so iconic, and the symbolic importance of having a Smithsonian institution on the National Mall dedicated to the first Americans is just extremely powerful, and so that's why they're there. And they also do great work for people who live nearby DC or in DC. I can't encourage you enough to go there and learn about Native people all over the United States and all over the hemisphere.
Okay. Sylvia asks if you could say something about data sovereignty as part of tribal sovereignty.
Yeah, absolutely. Data sovereignty is really important when we think again about those fundamental issues around self-governance, tribes determining their own futures, and taking control over, information about them. So, data sovereignty is also really important when it comes to, the digital age that we live in, and making something like this accessible to a totally public audience. Of course, when you're dealing with indigenous communities, there are times at which there is certain information that is privileged to maybe a particular family, or particular group of people within the community. And so being a native person myself, I'm Chickasaw. I always try to be very cognizant of, carrying out my research in a way that is very partnership based, reciprocal, non-exploitive, and non-extractive. Yeah, so thank you for bringing up that point about data sovereignty.
The next question is from Sylvia. She asks, what can we do to help support tribes that are not recognized federally?
That's another really good question. For folks who don't know, essentially, there is a system of federal recognition for tribal nations, which involves the federal United States government recognizing essentially the legitimacy of the government of tribal nations. Of these, today, there are 574. What's really interesting about federal recognition, again, for folks who are maybe hearing this term for the first time, is that it is very much socially constructed. So that's how we get situations like what I said earlier, where we have tribes gaining federal recognition, right? In the present moment, it's not a stagnant category. And so, similarly, related to that, there are tribes or communities who are not federally recognized. Some of those are recognized on the state level, meaning that the state acknowledges them, and some do not have that. So, when we talk about federal recognition, it's really important that we understand processes of colonization, and what it means to have a government to government relationship between a tribal government and the federal United States. So as far as supporting tribes without federal recognition, I would say the best way to do that is to understand this context, understand the factors at play, and just get involved with the community directly.
Just as a note, we're past the 6 p.m. point, so if any of our attendees need to leave, we understand. We do have a number of questions, so Dr. Rule, if you do have some time to stay for a little while and answer them,
Sure.
just let
About
me know.
10
Yeah,
more minutes or so.
10 more minutes. Okay.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. I understand. It's the evening, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. We have a question asking about any ongoing archaeological excavations in the DC area that you know of.
So that's definitely out of my wheelhouse, unfortunately. Yeah, I can't speak to that at all.
Okay. Again, I am going to recommend if you have additional questions or if there's something that we can't answer here tonight, get in touch with your librarians. We'll be happy to dig into it for you. Just give us a call tomorrow when we open. Okay. Let's see. We have a couple more suggestions of things that you might be interested in. There's the Gulf Branch Park in Arlington and the Arlington Historical Society. So thank you to the person who suggested that.
Thank you.
Let's see. Catherine asks if you're aware of the tradition of Indigenous poetry in Virginia. There's some early recordings by English travelers from the early 1600s, and there's some books about that subject. Do you know anything about that?
I don't, but I've made a note here to look into that again as I think about potentially venturing into Virginia.
Okay. We have a question that's more about library resources from Sylvia. Does the library have specific resources for researching Virginia tribes? I am not sure about that. We do have a Center for Local History here at Arlington Public Library, but again, I would suggest that anybody who's interested in learning more get in touch with their local public library, and if we can't find the resources for you here at our own branch, we will refer you to someone who can. Let's see. Do you have other people that you're working with on this mobile app project? Do you have a large research team, or are you a one-woman show?
I wish I had a large research team. I am mostly a one-woman show. I do work with someone on the technology side. Again, very very different from my wheelhouse. And of course, I work with various consultants, experts on particular aspects of DC history, community members to learn about these particular sites. But as far as the actual curation of the sites, the content creation, the vision of the project, and the promotion, it's a one-woman show. Again, as it relates to the Guide to Indigenous Baltimore, I'm really looking forward to working closely with a partner there. But Yeah, it's primarily born out of my own, passion for this issue, and really meeting a need that I saw.
Well, we have a number of people who simply put in the Q&A that they really appreciated this webinar. They wanted to thank you. A lot of them have already downloaded the app.
Thank you.
Um, let's see, we have a question from Priscilla. Will you have reference to the many archives that hold materials relating to Indigenous culture and history? She references the National Museum of Natural History
Mhm.
as a good resource.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point to bring up. Right now, places like that, really that hold archival materials are not incorporated, primarily because of the access issue. I really wanted to focus on places where, pretty much anyone off the street could walk in and see, whatever that site was on the map. But you're absolutely right that there are many institutions in DC with Indigenous collections or holdings in their archives. And I can say that I'm in conversation with one of them about creating, again, an app that explores their holdings as it relates to Indigenous people.
Okay. We have another suggestion from Marks. The second floor of NMAI has a small display on the indigenous peoples of this region.
Yes. Yeah, and I would just point that out to everyone, that that's a great place to learn about the indigenous peoples who traditionally occupy this area. That was put together, if I understand correctly, by Dr. Gabrielle Tyack, who is a friend and mentor of mine, and one of the people who I spoke to at length about this project.
Anna also suggests the NSA Cryptography Museum at Fort Meade if anybody's interested in the Navajo code talkers. Somebody had a question about that. So again, the NSA Cryptography Museum at Fort Meade apparently has information on them. Okay. And are you going to include any information about, along with the museums, but are you going to include any information about local libraries or archival resources? John is asking about the National Archives, particularly the BIA records.
Yeah, so again, right now I don't really look at the various offices that have archival material, but again, that's not to say that it's not there. I haven't tapped into those. They're not incorporated as sites, again, because usually accessing those is a little bit more involved. It is available to the public in some scenarios, but oftentimes you have to make an appointment and a request. And you know there are really great materials there for people who want to do that deeper dive. And I am doing some of that deeper dive, by translating this app into a book. But as far as making them sites themselves, I'm really focusing on more of those, very easy, very publicly accessible places.
Okay. And we just had a couple of people, I'm going to make this the last question because I do want to be respectful of your time. There were a couple of people who had a question about what tribe you belong to and where that tribe is located.
Sure. So I'm a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation. We are originally from the southeastern United States, but we're one of the tribes removed as part of the Indian Removal Act or the Trail of Tears. So now our tribal headquarters is in Oklahoma. I'm from Texas originally, but I've been living in DC for just over 3 years now.
Okay. Well, we were able to get through a ton of questions and you gave us so much information. Again, if anybody hasn't downloaded the app, I would encourage them to do so. And of course, if you would like more information, contact your local librarians. We are always happy to get research and reference questions. We love it. Thank you so much, Dr. Rule, for being with us here tonight. This was really informative, really interesting, and it brings to light a lot of really good topics.
Well, thank you so much, Megan, for facilitating this conversation. Thank you so much to everyone who attended, and especially those who asked questions and made suggestions. I really appreciate them all. And again, love doing that community dialogue with you all. And thank you to the library for hosting this event and inviting me to share my work.
And just as a note, we had over 160 people join us tonight. So
Wonderful.
that shows a great interest in this topic.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all again.
Okay, thank you so much.